Surely Ukraine is not the prelude. As Emmanuel Macron was departing Guangzhou on Friday, Chinese warships were cruising towards the Taiwan straits. We'll ask about the three-day show of force staged as a show of displeasure, you might say, what with last week's visit by the Taiwanese president to California and the U.S. Navy destroyer that was then dispatched to what China claims are its territorial waters. Are Beijing and Washington really fixing for a fight? After Ukraine, can the United States stomach a second superpower showdown? More broadly, why Taiwan? We'll ask about the stakes surrounding the world's top manufacturer of semiconductors, a liberal democracy that Beijing has vowed to retake in time for the centenary of the communist revolution in 2049. Is this also Europe's fight? On that score, we'll hear what Emmanuel Macron thought after 3 days of a state visit inside of China. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at those rising tensions over Taiwan. And joining us from the capital, Taipei, Brian Yeo, founding editor of New Bloom magazine. Thank you for staying up late and joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Economist Jean-Paul Chang is with us as well. How are you? And joining us from Birmingham, England, former British military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Mission accomplished, by the way, says Beijing. After 3 days of drills, they're finished for now. The drills, which included simulating the blockade of the island of Taiwan. Leo McGuinn has more.
3 days of war games around Taiwan, successfully completed according to China, serving as a stark warning to those seeking Taiwanese independence.
This is a serious warning against the collusion and provocation of the Taiwan independent separatist forces to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity. We hope the international community will fully understand the essence of the Taiwan issue, firmly abide by the One China principle, and firmly oppose all forms of Taiwan independent separatist activities.
The PLA's Eastern Command released a statement on Monday, saying that their troops were ready to fight over Taiwan and would resolutely smash any form of Taiwan independent separatism and foreign interference attempts. The Chinese war games began after Taiwanese President Ing-wen returned home from meeting the US House Speaker in Washington. According to the PLA, it simulated precision strikes against Taiwan on key targets on and around the island on Sunday. It even put out a short animation of simulated land, sea and air attacks on its WeChat account. The military also rehearsed sealing off the democratically run island, which Beijing considers a breakaway region.
PLA's recent harassment with their assets has destabilized the region. This time, President Tsai's visit became their excuse to conduct exercises, and their actions have severely jeopardized the security of the surrounding region.
Meanwhile, a US Navy vessel sailed through the South China Sea near the disputed Spratly Islands. The ship got within 12 nautical miles of Mischief Reef, on which there are Chinese military bases. The US Navy says it conducted normal operations at open sea, stressing that it is not an island and does not have territorial waters under international law.
Brian Hill, we saw there were big drills after Nancy Pelosi came and visited Taiwan. How did that compare with this time?
So there were some similarities, for example, in terms of how the Taiwanese population reacted. Similar to the Pelosi live fire exercises, the live fire exercises took place afterwards, there's not a very strong reaction. People were mostly calm. Taiwan has had decades of military threats directed at it. And so people are usually quite calm in such circumstances. Whether that means complacency or just the frog being boiled in rising water, it's a different question entirely. But it is actually true then that there's not a strong reaction. And so if that was the attempt by China to psychologically intimidate, that did not seem to be successful. In that regards, the visit by Pelosi to Taiwan took place in Taiwan, whereas the meeting between Tsai and McCarthy, the Taiwanese president and the current US Speaker of the House, it was in America. It was a way to dial back tensions that did not take place in Taiwan itself. Yet, in spite of that, China reacted nonetheless. And so that's why we do have these drills at present.
And how do you feel? Do you feel like you're in a frog that's in a pot of water that's quietly boiling?
Not particularly. I think part of it is that the Taiwanese population would react to what are genuine threats. It is true that we've had decades to deal with that, but there are moments in which there's a much stronger sense of threat, such as after the invasion of Ukraine or after the protests in Hong Kong in 2019. And so that was not the case this time, because I think the population at large did realize that this is not warfare. An invasion would be telegraphed months in advance, for example. The troops amassing on the shores of China would be detectable by satellites. On the other hand, this was practice for a blockade, and so China does seek the pretext to practice military action. The more practice you can get, the more odds of such an action succeeding. And so that is what we see in present. However, I think the population is calm, and for me, myself, I also feel more about the same.
We're joining our conversation, and I want to welcome her from Miami, June Teufel-Dreyer, professor of political science at the University of Miami. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Let me begin by asking, you at this particular point in time, you just heard Brian Hyo mention how people in Taiwan taking this in stride this time. Is it just going through the motions?
I don't think so. I think that China was very angry and reacted very, very harshly when Nancy Pelosi visited. And there were several days of exercises after that. But I think they got angrier when at the idea of Kevin McCarthy visiting, because they didn't want this to get to be a habit. And they felt they had to escalate still further. So to my mind, at least, these drills were an order of magnitude, that is the last 3 days drills, were an order of magnitude greater. And to me, and I believe I have heard Brian say this on another occasion, the harder the Chinese communists push, the more belligerent they get, the more it energizes the Taiwan population to want to resist this brutality that they see played out on their television screens. So to me, this is a ratcheting up of Chinese aggression, and it will have no good effects either in Taiwan or in the United States.
Philip Ingram, do you agree, or is this perhaps, it's 3 days, it's over? What can you say about the magnitude of these drills?
Well, there's definitely a ramping up, and I think this is the first time that we've seen the Chinese carrier group integrated into some of their more complex operations. And part of this was to practice that capability in this sort of scenario. But we have to remember that there are three real audiences that are here. There's the Taiwanese people and the wider Chinese threat to the Taiwanese people. There's the people of China itself, where Xi Jinping is trying to show to them that if there are breakaway provinces, he is being strong in sending a message and dealing with them. And then there's the wider international community, where China is trying to slowly but surely exert itself much more over the whole of Southeast Asia, and is trying to bully the international community into being frightened and staying away and treating it as China's own backroom territory and avoid that. And that's why we're seeing major things like changes in the Japanese constitution. We're seeing the need to have more and more freedom of navigation warships going through different areas to try and send clear messages back to Beijing that they can't be the Southeast Asian bully boy.
Yeah, and we saw the United States dispatch the USS Milius, the Navy destroyer, which sailed, by the way, near the Spratly Islands. That's an archipelago that's claimed by China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and there you see on the map where part of where it's gone. Jean-Paul Chang, the Pentagon says that this was scheduled. The U.S. Navy destroyer sailing into what China claims as its own waters. What reaction out of Beijing, you think?
They consider it like diversion from the Americans compared to their own drills around Taiwan first. And it's
do they take it in stride, or do they really take offense to this?
What they say that they follow this. They are not surprised and not. They didn't feel really threatened by, but they they reaffirm that of course it's a Chinese territorial water, but they consider that as an American answer to their drills around Taiwan and action of diversion.
And we saw June Teufel Dreyer was mentioning how this is also galvanizing the Taiwanese. So let me ask you, Brian Hyo, on this point. What sets these drills apart this time and this sit down with the U.S. Speaker of the House is that you also had the leader of Taiwan's opposition in China, former President Ma Ying-jeou, who went on a 12-day visit ahead of elections. So at the end of the day, when those elections happen, will this be a factor, what we've just witnessed?
So I think that does point to one of the reasons why China will conduct drilling at this juncture. The aim is to influence elections. Because if China were to conduct an invasion of Taiwan, it would be incredibly costly in terms of the lives lost or the impact to the economy. Not only because of semiconductor dominance by Taiwan currently internationally, but because of the size of the Taiwanese economy and the size of the Chinese economy, and the two are interlinked. And so Ma Ying-jeou, the former president, is trying to then ramp up the narrative that his party, the former authoritarian party of Taiwan, the KMT, if it held power, then that China would not conduct such threats directed at Taiwan. However, he visited China claiming that this would lessen cross-strait tensions, and these drills happen nonetheless. And so there's that narrative, and the KMT, his party, is expected to continue to kind of double down on this narrative. And so China, one reason why they do these drills is to really benefit his party. But will have the opposite effect, as is intended, of pushing the electorate into backing Taiwan's DPP. That's also to be seen, because the fact is there have been past occasions in which Chinese shows of force have actually pushed the population into voting for the DPP. They're angered by what they view as infringements of Taiwanese sovereignty, military threats, intimidate cow or intimidate Taiwanese democracy. And so the effect is precisely the opposite of what China would intend otherwise as directed at Taiwan, that Taiwan then tries to double down on its democratic institutions and then vote for what it views as the actors that are able to maintain those institutions.
Jean-Paul Chang, you agree this will backfire for the Kuomintang?
I'm not so sure, but I share the opinion that all these drills and all this show of strength is targeting to influence the next year's elections. Whether the calculation by Beijing is correct, I'm not so sure, because I believe that Beijing based the analysis on the result of the last local elections, municipal elections in Taiwan, and they have some hopes that maybe by putting a choice between war or peace, maybe some part of the Taiwanese electorate will prefer to not vote for DPP next time. That's anyway, that's their calculation for sure, that they try to influence the next year's election.
And you agree with Brian that it will backfire?
I don't know enough the evolution of the public opinion in Taiwan, but maybe that will backfire.
The drills that we've just seen to be expected, as we've said at the outset, after last week's sit-down in California between Taiwan's president and the most powerful Republican on Capitol Hill, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. In the end, he, as was pointed out, he didn't go to Taipei like his predecessor. But the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee has since. Michael McFaul was feted on Saturday with a state lunch by President Tsai. While she was still in the Americas, Emmanuel Macron was in China. The French president gave an interview on the plane home where he tried to distance himself from the United States. The question Europeans need to answer Is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? No. The worst thing that would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the U.S. agenda and a Chinese overreaction. What's your reaction to Emmanuel Macron's reaction, Jean-Paul Chang?
Macron is actually, he was so happy of his visit in China when he received a very warm reception. And so I believe that he adopted a kind of a traditional Gaullist position and decided that Taiwan is not his business at all. And anyway, and he's not going to intervene. And it's not in the interest of Europe and because it's so too far. There's no direct interest of Europe involved.
Is it too far? I mean, the French are players in the Pacific. They have a naval presence there too.
Yes, but it's the New Caledonia is far away from Taiwan.
We saw the French president attending regional summits this year in the Pacific, something he's never done before.
Yes, but still, I mean, among the 51 points of the communiqué, Sino-French communiqué, there's one point. It's a regular meeting between the Chinese and the French army about all this problem of military presence in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. But that's it, because the traditional position of France is not to be involved in this dispute about Taiwan, in spite of the fact that some parliamentarians in France are very eager to increase the relation with Taiwan.
And China's ambassador to Paris, who's complained loudly about it in the past. Philip Ingram, you agree this is not France's fight?
Well, I think there's two different issues here. And the one thing that will stop the Chinese from invading Taiwan is greater economic links into other major countries around the world. And remember, China is probably very quickly going to become the largest economy in the world. And therefore, for France, for the EU and elsewhere, it's very important that there are good diplomatic and trade links built up and maintained. And because of that, that in itself will create a degree of stability, whilst the Chinese military and Xi Jinping will continue to threaten and display and you put all of these shows of force on. Actually, if one of the things that has scared him is the international community's reaction to Russia with their illegal invasion of Ukraine and the economic sanctions that were very quickly put on Russia. That's the last thing that Xi Jinping would want put on him because of the impact that would have economically on China itself and therefore him politically. So I think it's important that leaders like Emmanuel Macron go in and develop the political links and continue to develop the trade links that we have with China, because that in itself will lead to greater stability in the region.
Okay. The French president, by the way, his Twitter feed this Monday putting out a highlights clip of his China visit. It included excerpts like this one.
Je crois qu'il y a une attraction réciproque entre la Chine et la France. Une fascination, une amitié, un chemin un peu singulier. Nous avons aujourd'hui à œuvrer pour éviter toute escalade et tout à la fois préserver et réinventer un ordre international de paix et de stabilité. Je crois très profondément à l'amitié entre la Chine et la France, à la coopération entre nos entreprises, nos entrepreneurs. Il a dit des trucs qui laissent normalement bâtir quelque chose.
He said things that could be the basis for something. Philip Ingram, does this send the wrong message, that little clip we saw?
I don't think so. I think it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's the two things that France and China have in common is they both want to try and improve their economic positions with each other, and they're major trading partners, and that doesn't impact anything else. What I think Francois Macron has avoided are any comments to do with human rights and the Uyghur population and the drills that are going on and the potential destabilization that'll happen. But his visit was political and it was economic, and I think that is important to keep emphasizing that and to keep putting that out, because that will keep stability. However, I do think from a longer term perspective, we're in a difficult position here. China is thinking in multi-generational terms. It can plan 20, 25 years out. Whereas if we look at our European nations or the United States, we think in presidential or prime ministerial timeframes, 3 to 5 years, and we're running around trying to achieve things very quickly. China will outmaneuver us on every occasion if we can't get into that longer-term thinking.
So, John Teufel-Dreyer, going into China, the French president talking about de-risking instead of decoupling. We talked about it last week with Jean-Paul Cheng on this very set. And now this little video clip talking about the friendship between France and China coming out of the visit. Your reaction? June Teufel-Dreyer, can you hear us? I seem to have lost the connection there with Miami. We'll try to reconnect. I'll put it to you, Brian Ho. Your thoughts on how the French president communicated over his trip?
So it is a question. I mean, I think the hope from everybody is that China just simply is happy to trade with whether Western powers or even Taiwan itself, rather conducting an adventurous military action that benefits nobody and would cause not only economic cataclysm to the world because of its dependence on Taiwan's semiconductors, but also lead to extreme loss of life for itself and for other countries. But then the question, I think, particularly after Ukraine and the kind of high tensions regarding what course of action is to be taken regarding Chinese military threats, the question is, do you accommodate China or do you try to take a tougher stance, which will actually deter China from taking this kind of course of military action? And so I think it is a debated question.
Yeah, because Brian, we can see, Brian, what we can see is what was put on for public display. Of course, you can always make the argument that maybe behind closed doors, Macron read Xi Jinping the Riot Act on things like, as Philip was mentioning, human rights. But in the end, what's the right language to have in public when you're dealing with Beijing?
That's a question, I think, particularly when you're in this kind of position of negotiation. And so there has been a lot of criticism of Macron internationally as accommodating China, as being weak on China in the face of these aggressive actions, as though, well, for example, the notion that Europe should not actually criticize China, but should actually step back from what is seen as a primarily U.S. and China conflict. I think that the countries of the world, whether Europe or anywhere else really, will be drawn to potential conflict between the U.S. and China, because it's not just a question of the U.S. and China, but it's a question of economic interests, of values, and so forth. And so it would actually be a significant event. But there is the notion that you can step back and be a kind of pushing for peace, as though whatever happens, regardless of how it happens, it would not drag the entire world into the potential cataclysm.
Brian Hill mentioning the issue of values. Jean-Paul Cheng, where France's president might have an interest is liberal democracy, rules-based international order, the argument being that investors now are frightened and leaving China because they feel as though after what's happened in Hong Kong, after zero COVID, it's going to be a place where it's going to be harder to do business because of rule of law issues, and that therefore they should be supporting Taiwan more.
Yeah, but I mean, business is business. So somehow, I mean, now the China put an end to the zero COVID policy and the country is open again. The trend is not investor leaving; they're coming. You just see the delegation of businessmen which went to Beijing with
number of French business people in China down 20%, Germans down 30%.
Yeah, but
there's a lot of people who don't want to go back to China anymore.
That's true, but it just also you see a lot of people now are on the waiting list to visit China again. So I believe the trend will be clear in some months. Now the Chinese economy is picking up slowly, but picking up. IMF predicted for this year, India and China will represent half of the world economic growth. So it's important for investors still, the Chinese market. So I believe that it's a state visit by Macron, and Macron is happy to go as eco state. China considers France as a power, not a superpower, but a big country. So, of course, he's taking care of the subject, public subject of his speech. He will, of course, in closed door, I believe, behind the closed door, mention the problem of human rights, Taiwan even. But I believe that he has all the interest because the payback for the French position within even the European Union is very important for him to show that France is able to speak égal to China, and it's a moment after 3 years of absence of direct contact, and of course he wants to exploit in maximum the impact that France is still the country able to talk to Xi Jinping, to talk to China. And it's also a problem of competition within the European Union about the place of France, the role that France want to play. Well, France want to have some weight on the European diplomacy and don't want to be hostage of a single country like Lithuania or another small country among the 27.
You mentioned Lithuania because they have ties with Taiwan, for which the Chinese have punished them.
No, let's say that they have a very tough position, okay? And because of the European solidarity, other countries are, of course, condemned to follow, to assume to assure the solidarity, and that is it's a kind of a blockade of the relation between Europe and China.
Philip Ingram, again, we go back to the issue of how far European nations go in defense of Taiwan and, as Brian Hill mentioned, of its values.
Well, we've seen a major pivot in NATO's stance and the UK stance. Last year, if you remember, the first ever deployment of HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's aircraft carrier, with its task group that was made up of ships from different NATO countries, was done into Southeast Asia, and it carried out freedom of navigation exercises around some of the disputed areas. We're seeing increasing rhetoric around security behind Chinese firms involved in 5G, involved in CCTV and elsewhere, and that is coming across the whole of the EU, UK, and into the United States. And we're seeing post-pandemic a lot of countries suddenly realizing that they don't want to rely, they can't rely on this just-in-time supply chain coming from China, because it breaks down whenever everyone in the world wants an increased amount of capability, and that's coming back home nationally, and that will be concerning the Chinese.
It'll be concerning the Chinese at the same time, and I'll put it to June Teufel Dreyer. We have news this Monday of Tesla, which says it's going in with plans to build a new battery plant in Shanghai. Your thoughts on that? Is decoupling over-exaggerated?
I do think that decoupling is exaggerated. And however, Mr. Tesla doesn't really have a nationality. What he does is he wants to make money. And he also makes these batteries in the United States. So he is carefully hedging his bets here. And he is also aware that Tesla is going to face some very stiff competition from Chinese EVs. So he is diversifying his business from just cars to batteries, and also ensuring that since he's creating jobs in Shanghai, the Chinese government may treat him well. Now, one of your earlier commenters talked about Mr. Macron, who was very happy to be in China. And I was thinking, yes, he sure is happy to be in China, because somehow he does not seem to be very popular with large segments of the French electorate. And I should say that half my family lives in France, and so I do hear quite a bit about French politics. I am wondering, however, if it is really true that France has no interest in what goes on in Taiwan, because among other things, France needs advanced computer chips as much as any other country for its advanced planes, submarines, cars, whatever. And if it can't get them because they've been destroyed by some conflict in the Taiwan Strait, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, still today, Taiwan or Taiwanese companies produce an estimated half of the world's semiconductors. We could show you a list of statistics compiled back in 2021 by the Boston Consulting Group, and you see that line in the middle was when it afterwards it becomes the prediction there of how much. And Taiwan's share is huge. And my question on that, June, is we came out of COVID with European nations here talking about diversifying, realizing their overdependence on Chinese-made goods. But that also extends to semiconductors, does it not?
Does it extend to semiconductors made in China or semiconductors made in Taiwan?
Semiconductors, period. The idea being that the Europeans will want to produce their own more, the Americans will want to produce their own more, etc.
Everybody's been trying, but as I'm sure Brian can confirm, the high-end chips, the highest-end chips, over 90% come from Taiwan. And Taiwan has some wonderful scientists, and they want to keep it that way. So the United States is welcome to try. South Korea is welcome to try. They are trying. So far, the Chinese have been trying for 20 years, and they can't seem to get there. So it's not a done deal to say, okay, Taiwan has most of these computer chip manufacture now. We can do it too. The problem is whoever we is cannot seem to do it as well.
Brian Yo, what's the secret of Taiwanese semiconductors?
Yeah, so Morris Chang, historically the CEO of TSMC, Taiwan's major semiconductor manufacturing company, the founder, he recently stated, for example, in a meeting with Nancy Pelosi, the former U.S. House Speaker, during August actually, that he viewed it as futile for the U.S. to try to really fight with Taiwan in terms of its current dominance. And so it is in Taiwan's interest to maintain its current dominance in terms of semiconductors because of the fact that it incentivizes Western countries to defend Taiwan. And China as well is not encouraged to attack Taiwan because its own supply chains are dependent on Taiwanese semiconductors. There's a report in the Washington Post a while back, which the Taiwanese government did deny, but it said that, for example, even Taiwanese semiconductors are present in the missiles that Chinese forces have aimed at Taiwan. And so in this sense, though, the semiconductor industry really does benefit from this kind of alliance, let's say, between the state and industry. If the state really wants to keep the key processes in Taiwan, so other countries will defend it against Chinese aggression. And so there are fabs under construction in U.S. and Japan and other allies of Taiwan. In that sense, the advanced processes are intended to remain within Taiwan so that other countries will remain kind of dependent on Taiwan, and that way they'll be encouraged to defend it. Will that last forever? I'm not totally sure. But that is also a substrate of this. And so this not only encourages Western countries to defend Taiwan, but discourages China to attack it.
Jean-Paul Chang, this will go on for a long while?
Yeah, I believe.
So Taiwan is safe as long as they can...
Yeah, I believe that's also the analysis of the French presidency, that actually the danger of open crisis is rather small. And that's why... unless the kind of accident between United States and China, otherwise the Chinese are making the show of strength, but they don't have any interest to provoke a war. So and that's why that's explain what Macron says, that he don't want Europe to follow the United States in order to avoid the acceleration of the crisis. That's.
Is that how you read it, Philip Ingram, particularly when it comes to this so strategic in this information age component, which are these semiconductors?
Yeah, China certainly doesn't want to provoke a war in the short term. It does want to increase its influence in the region, and this is why we're seeing, in particular on the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, China turning what were shoals into islands and then populating them and trying to then claim under international law territorial waters around them. And the impact that that's having across the whole region is something that we have to be very cognizant of. The Japanese have changed their constitution to allow them to have aircraft carriers and to allow them to deploy Japanese troops overseas. And the increase in military power projection capability that's coming out, China's growing it with its submarine capability, with its aircraft capability. India's procuring aircraft carrier capability. India's procuring aircraft carriers. Japan has just changed its constitution to allow it to get aircraft carriers. Power projection is all about taking a military force to somewhere else and doing something with it. The escalation that's going on across the whole region does not bode well at all for future stability.
I want to bring into that mix as well the traditional rivalry between Japan and South Korea. Is that all part of it?
Well, the traditional rivalry between all of the different players in there, and then throw in
the fact that they've reconciled.
Yes, but throw in a completely random despot who's got access to nuclear weapons with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And we've got a tinderbox where someone is pouring petrol on and someone is trying to strike a match. And at any stage, something could cause this just to blow up. And it would be something that we're not necessarily expecting. So we have to be very careful and watch very closely what's going on. And of course, coming into wider destabilization in the region is if Russia falls apart after the Ukraine war, the Russian Federation, some of the statelets that are bordering on China's borders, China might have an interest in going and trying to stabilize those. And we're then getting into wider issues of stabilization and military capability coming into different things. I think in the long term, we have to be very concerned.
June Teufel-Dreyer, when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine more than a year ago now, people were worried that this was one of those World War I moments where one event sparks a whole chain of events and leads to a global conflict. Is the danger greater here in Europe where we are, or again, between Taiwan and China?
Well, again, I think it depends which moment in World War II you want to latch on to.
World War I, I was talking about here. In
I see. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, this is certainly a valid concern, but we don't have the kinds of alliances now in place that we did at the time of World War I, and there is no one saying that regicide is a crime worth going to war for. So what we do have is a concern about where do you allow China to stop. China has been very, very explicit about this. It wants to change the international world order, and it wants China to be on the centerpiece of that world order. So when Monsieur Macron says that France has no stake in what goes on in Taiwan, I think he's being really rather short-sighted.
In fairness, that's not what he said. He said that that Europe should have a third way and that it shouldn't be following the U.S.'s lead all the time.
Well, I can certainly agree that Europe shouldn't want to follow the U.S. lead, but what I have seen quoted is his saying that France has no stake in what happens with Taiwan, and that is absolutely an untenable project, because this fits in with the Chinese wanting to change the world, and that would certainly affect France, and it would certainly affect all of Europe. And this is one of those things, and I mentioned World War II here, because is accommodating China on this, as Monsieur Macron seems want to do, is this akin to saying it's peace in our time, and Mr. Hitler will never attack? Is it? Where do you stop China? As somebody mentioned before, that China is expanding in the South Pacific. France has important territories in the South Pacific, and you cannot just say, well, it doesn't matter. Taiwan is far away from the South Pacific. China is active in the South Pacific also, where France has territories. So where do you say to China, this is the place to stop? Or do you end up in history looking like Neville Chamberlain?
At the outset of our conversation, Brian Ho, you said to us effectively that Taiwanese people were taking these 3-day drills in stride. Do they take Emmanuel Macron's remarks in stride?
So there has been some reaction. It's not the dominant conversation at present because there's still more focus on the military drills, which are, of course, occurring close to Taiwan. But I think that particularly for Taiwan, in terms of its views on democracy or the allies it hopes to have, Macron's comments have provoked condemnation because of the fact that it's viewed as a betrayal of what were thought to be shared democratic values. And so there has been a reaction. And so particularly at a time of strengthening relations between Taiwan and Western powers, not only the U.S., but also with Europe. There was a French delegation, of course, that visited Taiwan recently. I think that Macron's comments are seen as somewhat disheartening because I think what people hope for are ties of alliance or ties of friendship on the basis of shared values.
Officially, by the way, Taiwan is called the Republic of China. It's recognized as a state by only a handful of nations since the nationalists fled Mao's revolution in 1949. Beijing's current leader has doubled down on several occasions on the goal of full reunification before the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic in 2049.
Taiwanese compatriots should know that Taiwanese independence can only lead Taiwan to grave disaster. People should resolutely oppose Taiwanese independence, separatists, and jointly seek a bright future, a peaceful reunification.
Philip Ingram, have recent events in Hong Kong changed the way the world looks at those kinds of statements?
I think very much so. China has always been trying to propose one country, two systems, and propose that as a solution through the Taiwanese opposition and into Taiwan. But I think the Chinese crackdown in Hong Kong has shown that that one country, two systems doesn't work, and China wants one country, one system, and that will embolden, I think, the Taiwanese people to continue along the path of supporting the political parties that are pushing for proper full recognition of Taiwan as a state by itself, and not this sort of halfway house that the international community seems to be being forced to sit in every time Taiwan is talked about in relation to China and its position in China. I think Xi Jinping is doubling down every time he says things, and at his the 20th opening the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, when he said he would never give up the potential for the use of force to retake Taiwan. I think that was a very clear political statement, and is something that the international community need to hold him to account over.
Up to now, Jean-Paul Chang, Communist Party congresses were mostly about economics. In his speech, Xi Jinping talked about security this time.
Yeah, a lot of times. Yeah.
So is it coming to a head with Taiwan, is my question.
Let's say that China, I believe that China got impatient with the Taiwan problem because they understood that they are spending a lot of resources about this problem, and they are paralyzed in the diplomatic relations because of the pending problem with Taiwan. So they are probably trying to accelerate not a military solution, but a kind of a political solution. And that's why I believe that they're betting everything on the next year's election in Taiwan. And I'm not sure that they've been successful.
In being successful. Brian Hill, one final question because we're out of time. Again, we talked about that economic interdependence. In the Cold War, there was virtually no trade between the Soviet Union and the West. Is that Taiwan's biggest guarantor?
Well, it is a question. I mean, everyone asks that, for example. In the past, China really wanted to create the perception that the Taiwanese economy is completely dependent on the Chinese economy. And so, for example, if you shut off tourism, the Taiwanese economy will collapse. COVID proved otherwise because there's no tourism. But then China still wants to use the economic means of pressuring Taiwan. Taiwan is dependent on China, or at least a very large part of its economy is tied to China. And so what do you do then? And that is a question for Taiwan too. And so that's why there's the attempt to build stronger ties with the US, with European countries, with Southeast Asian countries as a way to reduce dependency on China. But then what happens when those options are removed? These means that are not directly warfare for China to influence Taiwan, they're political, they're economic. And so there's the fear then that perhaps China will tilt towards that if these other levers of pressuring Taiwan are removed. And so I think that's what we really need to keep an eye on in the future. And that's where other powers in the world really have a place to play or a way to influence things which prevent conflict from breaking out.
Brian Heo, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Taipei. I want to thank Philip Ingram in Birmingham, June Teufel Dreyer in Miami, Jean-Paul Chang. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.